Hello, everyone. We have Richard today with us, and we are talking on a very interesting topic that how muscle and how resistance training has deep impact on cardiovascular health, how you can improve your cardiovascular health, how it is also important in healthy aging, in maintaining muscle mass, lean muscle mass to your body, and several other aspects of it. So I'm happy, Richard, I have you on the podcast. How are you?
I am good. Abby, thank you very, very much for having me. I'm really happy to
Thank
be
you.
here today.
Yeah, and I was just going through your latest research that you have done on which is talking about cardiovascular health and muscle, and also exercise science and exercise relevance on that. Can you just talk something about that? That is a very fascinating topic.
Yeah, so when a lot of people think about cardiovascular health, they
Mm-hmm.
automatically think about aerobic exercise or what people would call cardio. And there's good reason for that. We know that cardiovascular exercise has a massive benefit on the structure and function of the heart and all of the blood vessels that supply the heart and other parts of the body. And we do know that cardiovascular fitness is probably one of the best predictors of freedom from
Mm-hmm.
cardiovascular disease and long-term good health as well. But my particular research wants to focus on something in particular, and we wanted to focus on the benefits of muscle itself and strength as well. And the reason for that is if you look at, there's been a number of cross-sectional studies that have looked at populations over time. And what we see is that there tends to be a correlation between the amount of muscle that people have and their levels of strength and what we call longevity. So people who
Mm-hmm.
have higher levels of muscle, okay, and when I say higher levels of muscle, I'm not talking about like Arnold Schwarzenegger levels of muscle. I'm just talking like, high within the general population. People who have got higher levels of muscle and higher levels of muscle strength, they tend to live longer.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that we think is really, really interesting. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting on that as well is there's in cardiovascular science, so within people who've got cardiovascular disease, there's something that's called the obesity paradox. And,
Uh-huh.
and what the obesity paradox means is that people with a higher body mass index, or basically people who weigh more, they tend to actually survive better than people who've got a lower body mass index. And that surprised people for a long time because
Mm-hmm.
people were always, why would people who are heavier, like, they've got more body fat, why would they last longer? And we think actually that part of that effect might be because those people who have higher levels of body fat also tend to have higher levels of muscle. And you see that these people with higher levels of muscle live a little bit longer. And in fact, if you look at the opposite ends of the scale, people who have the lowest levels of muscle tend to die quicker after a cardiac event. So we think that muscle might have a bit of a protective effect. And that's something that within our
Mm-hmm.
research, we really want to look at more and understand more.
Okay. So, anybody who's having more of muscle, does that mean that the lean mass is more, like the fat-free mass is more on that body, and how the heart respond to that?
So yeah, that's a good point. You've mentioned fat free mass, and fat free mass is one of the methods that are, let's say, the measures that we regularly hear in research these days when talking about muscle. But the problem with saying fat free mass is that fat
Mhm.
free mass is not all muscle, unfortunately. So fat free mass is basically everything in your body that's not fat. So that can include muscle, obviously, but it can include bone, and it can also include the weight of organs. So
Mhm.
in our research specifically, what we like to look at are, there's a few different measures that we look at, but some of them are called skeletal muscle mass, which is the actual amount of skeletal muscles. That's the type of muscle that surrounds our bones and allows us to move. So that's one way of looking at it, skeletal muscle mass. Or another is something called appendicular lean mass, which is the amount of lean or fat-free mass on our arms and on our legs. And that kind of gives
Mhm.
us a better idea of total muscle. And it's a really, really good way of looking at interventions. So if we do something to somebody, if we send them to the gym, I think looking at skeletal muscle mass and looking at appendicular lean mass are better measures than looking at fat-free mass alone. But I do want to say one thing, and it's I don't think we should be focusing on muscle mass exclusively, because it's something that we can do a lot. And I know my own research focuses on a lot, but I think we also need to take into consideration strength,
Mm-hmm.
because strength is hugely important. And we do see that strength probably correlates with longevity even better than muscle size. And we see that people who, if you look at a population of older adults, those with the lowest levels of strength tend to have the higher levels of mortality. So they're more likely to die as well. And kind of just on that strength thing as well, strength is what allows us to do everything. So, it
Absolutely.
allows us to get out of bed in the morning and climb up the stairs and carry our groceries and play with our kids. And if you lose strength, you lose your ability to be independent and to do all of the things in life that we want to be able to do. And that can have a
Mm-hmm.
major effect on somebody's quality of life as well. So I think that's something we need to focus on a lot.
Okay, so we actually talked about quite a few things which are a lot contextual. We talked about muscle. So a muscle is something which everybody would have, but the quality and quantity of that will differ. So if you see anybody who's into, say, football, will have a different, say, strength of muscle. Anybody, say, in CrossFit, or anybody in, say, hardcore bodybuilding will have different quality and quantity of muscle. So how does that vary?
So that's interesting. So there have been studies that have been done, and what they've done is looked at older populations. And one of the more interesting ones was looking at a sedentary population,
Hmm.
a population of lifelong endurance athletes. So people
Hmm.
who have engaged in endurance sports like running and cycling, and then a group of lifelong weightlifters. So you've got three
Okay.
different groups there. You've got the sedentary, you've got the endurance, and then you've got this very, very much strength focused population. And what they noticed was that in terms of muscle mass, obviously the lowest amount of muscle mass was in the sedentary population.
Sedentary. Yeah.
As they got older, they had low levels of muscle mass. The
Hmm.
endurance athletes had more, and then the weightlifting population had even more as well, which is really good. That's what we would
Hmm.
expect to see. People who, if you use your muscles more, you're going to hold on to them a lot more as well. So that was one thing that we saw there. But they also looked at strength and endurance capability. And obviously, endurance capacity within the endurance athletes was better. And then absolute strength and your ability to produce force within the muscles was stronger in the older population. Now, sorry, in the weightlifting population. Now, we can't say that the weightlifting population and the endurance population, we can't say if there was going to be a major difference between them in terms of outcomes, because that
Hmm.
research didn't look at outcomes. Um, so one thing I kind of like to say on that when we're talking about muscle quality is, I think the most important thing with muscle quality, and I think, yeah, actually, I'll word this differently. Muscle quality is going to be far more important than muscle size. And the
Hmm.
reason I say that is because if we use, so for example, one of the devices that we use for measuring muscle is a DEXA. A lot of people will
Dexa.
have heard of
Yeah.
that before. And it's a device that uses X-rays to measure muscle. And it's very, very accurate, or at least it has the reputation of being very accurate.
Hmm.
But the problem with the DEXA is, if we get older, one thing that tends to happen as we get older is muscle gets smaller. But
Hmm.
what can also happen is we get something called fat infiltration within muscle, and the structure of muscle starts to change. And we actually get small amounts of fat that actually form within the muscle itself. We also get the formation of areas of connective tissue where the
Hmm.
muscle is just not as effective. Whereas if you look at, so that muscle might be large because it's got all of this connective tissue and it's got all of these deposits of fat, but it might not be very, very high quality, and it's not
Hmm.
able to produce the same amount of force, okay, and it's not able to have the same metabolic functions as for example, a smaller muscle that is very, very compact. It doesn't have all of this extra fat going through it or extra connective tissue. So muscle size is probably not the most important aspect. It's muscle quality, like you've mentioned there, but
Hmm.
that's a lot harder to measure. But one way to ensure good quality muscle is to make
Hmm.
sure that it's being used, because an active muscle is usually going to be a quality muscle.
Okay, so you have touched upon a very interesting topic. How does that happen that the quantity of muscle is more, but the usability of that is not actually in the absolute sense? How does that
Yeah,
happen?
so so it happens like with aging. So there's a as we get older, there's a process known as sarcopenia. Okay,
Yeah.
and sarcopenia is basically the age-associated loss of muscle
Hmm.
as we get older. And this happens because, and there's a number of reasons for it, but I will say that the primary reason for muscle loss, sarcopenia, as we get older, is inactivity. Basically,
Hmm.
as people get older, they do less, and that's usually because when we think about it, it's normal. Like if you're with an older person, you'll often hear, "Okay, you're older now. I'll do this for you. I'll help you with this.
Correct.
You don't need to lift that." And people are expected to, they retire when they get older. They're expected to do less. And I think that's a terrible policy. I think older people should definitely stay as active as they possibly can. But when we become less active, we give less stimulus to our muscles to maintain themselves. And what happens is muscles, they tend to shrink over time. They also lose some of their ability to generate force, so that you lose strength over time. And what can happen as well is, as we're getting older, because of that lack of activity, something that also happens is we get an increase in insulin resistance, or we lose insulin sensitivity. So our body's ability to process insulin when we eat carbohydrates. And what can happen is, and another thing that happens on top of that is, as we get older, people tend to gain body fat. Okay.
Hmm.
So we've got all of these things happening together. And what happens is we see that these muscles tend to get a little bit smaller, and we tend to see an accumulation of body fat. And body fat can accumulate in lots of different places.
Yeah.
But as we get older, it seems to accumulate more within muscles, which is not ideal. Because if you imagine a muscle, when it is a very, very compact muscle, it doesn't have any fat around it or any extra connective tissue, it's able to work at its best ability. It's able to contract to its maximum force.
Yeah.
But within that muscle, if you've got lots of connective tissue and if you've got lots of deposits of fat, that makes it exceptionally difficult to contract at its maximal force. So you lose the ability for that muscle to contract maximally. And that has a major effect on strength. And it's also a major indicator of poor metabolic health as well.
Okay. How can then, in that case, one minimize the accumulation of fat in muscle? Is that through only resistance training, or there can be any dietary interventions as well in that?
So exercise is going to be the number one way of doing it. Okay. If
Mhm.
somebody has excess body fat in general, so if somebody has excess body fat, losing that body fat is fantastic. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. If you lose excess body fat from your entire body, you will be losing it from those internal stores within muscle.
Mhm.
Um, Exercise is the way to do it. It can be endurance exercise, and it can be resistance exercise. There's one interesting aspect of endurance exercise, and that is that high levels of endurance exercise can actually cause the buildup of fat within muscle cells, but it's a particular type of fat that is incorporated within muscle cells and not within muscle, let's say, or sorry, in or around muscle fibers, because endurance athletes are just better able to metabolize fat because of the type of training that they do. So
Mhm.
their body builds up these fat stores. That's considered to be a healthy form of fat storage within muscles, but it's this unhealthy form that comes from inactivity that's the issue. But increasing activity does seem to help reduce that. And that, like I said, it can be endurance, it can be resistance exercise. Both will do it over time, along with a standard diet. There wouldn't be any particular diet that will lead to that. As long as it's a diet that is kind of calorie restricted, it can help to
Mhm.
reduce that accumulation of fat.
Okay, so just want to understand the basic concept for all of the audience. How does heart respond to resistance training? May it be of any kind, may it be lifting weight or running or doing a skipping or doing normal cardio on treadmill or an inclined walk. How does heart respond to exercise, to external stimuli?
Okay, so my research doesn't focus so much on cardiac physiology as it does on cardiometabolic health, and so things
Uh-huh.
like blood lipids. So, for example, so resistance exercise does seem to have some effects on cardiac physiology, but it doesn't have near the potent effects that aerobic exercise has
Mm-hmm.
on your heart physiology. And the reason I'm saying this is because oftentimes people will, when we speak, people will say, "Oh, you're the guy who talks about muscle and heart health," and like, so you're saying that all we need to do is lift weights, and we'll all be fine, and that'll take care of our heart. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not what I'm saying at all. I think a combination of both, so having resistance exercise and having some form of endurance or aerobic exercise on the side, combined together is the best way of looking after our heart health. But then we
Mm-hmm.
have to say, what is it about resistance exercise specifically that helps with our heart health, with cardiovascular health? And there's a few different things to look at. Um, One of them, and the one that is probably best documented, is the effect that resistance exercise has on our circulating blood levels.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, circulating glucose levels in the blood.
Okay.
And what happens is we see that there's a very, very nice curve. If you look at the lean mass on a person and you measure lean mass and its correlation with insulin sensitivity, you'll see that individuals, people who have higher levels of lean mass, are more insulin sensitive. That
Mm-hmm.
means that they're able to process insulin more. Their fasting glucose levels tend to be lower or within a much healthier range. And that's obvious because when we think about it, muscle is by far the greatest sink of glucose in our body. So when we
Mm-hmm.
consume carbohydrate, it gets digested, it goes into our blood straight away, our insulin level goes up, and the insulin goes up because our body needs to reduce those glucose levels to normal. And it can do that in a few different ways. But one of the primary ways that our body disposes of glucose is by sending it to the muscles where it gets converted into glycogen as a storage form. And if you have high quality muscles, so muscles that are used to exercising and that are used to being metabolically active, if you've got a lot of muscle on your body, you're better able to tolerate eating carbohydrates, and you're better able to process them. And that's important for cardiovascular health because one of the primary, let's say, comorbidities of heart disease is insulin resistance and even type 2 diabetes. And the reason for that is we think that when we have elevated levels of glucose in our body, it can actually contribute to some of what we call a process called atherosclerosis, or the development of a buildup of fatty tissue within our
Uh-huh.
arteries, which can eventually block our arteries and which can lead to basically lead to heart attacks or lead to other
Yeah.
cardiac events. So helping to reduce our blood sugar to a healthy range is a really good way of doing it. And having more muscle is one way of doing that. But that's not the only way that muscle can help. And one thing that we're trying to look at in my research at the moment is we want to see what are the effects of having more muscle on our blood lipids. And by that, we mean things like cholesterol and triglycerides. So our research at the moment is we're doing interventions with older people who've got heart conditions, and we're putting some of them through a resistance exercise program. We're trying to give them a high protein diet to build as much muscle as possible. And we want to see how that affects their blood lipids,
Mm-hmm.
because we have done some research. It's not published at the moment, actually, but we've done some research using something called Mendelian randomization. And that's kind of a statistical technique that uses information on our genes to calculate how certain effects on genes might affect other aspects of our health. And we've used Mendelian randomization to see what effect higher levels of muscle can have on some of our blood lipids. And we've seen that it can have an effect on particle size. So we know that blood lipids come in lots and lots of different particle sizes, and we've seen that they can actually have beneficial effects on some of our blood lipids, like HDL cholesterol, and even on VLDL cholesterol, very low
Mm-hmm.
density lipoproteins.
Yeah.
So that's one other area as well that we think may be very, very, very beneficial. And then potentially in reducing triglycerides, that can have a benefit on cardiac health as well. So those are some of the areas that we're trying to look at, but we have nothing definitive on that
Mm-hmm.
yet. And that's why we're doing this research at the moment, to try and figure out what is it specifically about muscle that is helping us to be healthier and helps people live longer and to reduce their risk of heart disease.
Great. Okay, so that's a very interesting. That would be a very interesting outcome to actually get to understand that. Yeah. So, how does the concept of HRV, that is heart rate variability, impacts on one's cardiac health? Kind
So,
of
so
in,
HRV is completely out of my wheel frame. It's not an area that I've
Okay,
looked
no
into in
worries, no
detail.
worries. So actually, in fact, why the reason why I asked that, there are times when anybody is training on assault bike. You have seen, you must have seen in CrossFit that is being used. Yeah,
Yeah, I use one myself. So
yeah. So actually, when you actually run on that assault bike, I have never seen a more tasking exercise than that. And in
it's
just,
unpleasant, yeah.
yeah, in just 1 minute, if in case you give your full force, you are actually like say more than 50, 60, or nearly 70 calories, and then your heart is pumping out of your body. It's actually like that. So is it okay, in fact, giving so much of, say, exertion on heart, is it okay at times just to make your heart like pump so much of blood, and keeping it into that zone? Is it okay, or is it advisable, or it is risky?
Well, so in somebody who's otherwise healthy and hasn't had any contraindications from their doctor, like, but I would never tell somebody who's sedentary to give this a try.
Mhm.
Like that would not be a pleasant experience for somebody else. But it is absolutely fine, and it's a trainable ability. And this is one of the principles behind high intensity interval training is pushing your heart rate to basically getting as close to your maximum heart rate as possible, because you want to give, like, basically everything in human physiology is about adaptation. Okay, we
Mm-hmm.
are always trying to find an adaptation to get better at something. Whether it's to get stronger, you go into the gym and you lift close to failure. That's how
Mm-hmm.
you get that adaptation, because you need to stress your body.
Yep.
The same goes if you want to improve your VO2 max. Those kind of high intensity interval training bursts done, like, and they can be done on an assault bike, like you've mentioned. So with
Yep.
any type of high intensity training, just like, high intensity interval training, pushing yourself to that limit is what drives the stimulus for you to develop your cardiovascular capacity, to improve VO2 max, to improve a whole host of other functions in your body. Just
Mm-hmm.
your vasculature, your the endothelia, which align your blood vessels to improve endothelial function, and there's no issue with it. Now, obviously, if somebody does have has an issue with their heart, they need to be very, very careful and build up to it. But it is possible for people to build up to it with proper supervision. Well, for some individuals, obviously. And then, obviously, if somebody is sedentary, they would need to be very, very cautious about doing this, and they would need to build up to those levels slowly. But yeah, we get a lot of benefit from very, very high intensity activity. So it's not something people should be afraid of. It's more something people should be conscious of, but I think it's something a lot of people should be aiming for, because most of us do not get near enough high intensity activity in our lives.
I totally agree. I totally agree to that. Okay. And when in that case, say anybody is training high intensity, how frequent that can be? I'm sure that it is not advisable to train on high intensity on a daily basis. There need to be some sort of regime that need to be planned, that when you should give rest to your heart, and then when you can push it to the limits.
Mm. So it's kind of similar to any type of programming for training. Is it needs to be very, very much built around the individual and what the individual's goals are. But I
Mm-hmm.
think for the general population, getting 2 or 3 sessions a week of high intensity interval training, or some very, very high intensity cardio is absolutely fine. And then incorporating with that some form of resistance exercise is really, really
Mm-hmm.
important as well. Obviously, like, and you may know this from your own experience as well, I think you will be very, very familiar with what your body is able to handle in terms
Yep.
of how many days you can go to the gym. So, like, for example, I know myself that I'm very, very capable of handling a high amount of volume in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
So I can do a lot. It doesn't give me any particular benefit, but I can recover from it.
Yeah,
quite well. But then other people might find that a high volume of work might be really poor from them. They might recover poorly. They might not be able to perform as well at subsequent sessions. So it's very important to just find the ideal level for the individual. And I know that's kind of a cop-out answer because it doesn't give us a specific answer for everybody, but that's because there is no specific answer for everybody. And like just putting in a little bit of time to discover what your own limits are or where your what is the ideal for you can have huge benefits for you down the line.
absolutely. It will be individualistic planning. Okay, so we have spoken very well and understood on the concept of exercise, the importance of muscle on that, and how well actually it can drive our life accordingly. So, talking about food and nutrition and also supplementation. So, is there any sort of kind of supplementation that can improve the cardiovascular health?
So there's lots of things that can improve cardiovascular health in different ways. If we talk about muscle on its
Mm-hmm.
own, obviously, people will talk about protein being incredibly important for muscle, and it absolutely is. The one thing I will say is in older adults, and this is the important part, is obviously I mentioned earlier that we have sarcopenia, which is this condition that we lose muscle as we get older. And I
Mm-hmm.
did say that one of the main reasons for that was inactivity. But another major component of why we lose muscle as we get older is something called anabolic resistance. And
Uh-huh.
this is when our body is not able to react as well to anabolic stimuli. And anabolic stimuli, the two primary ones are exercise, resistance exercise, and protein intake. So what that means in reality is if you give a person who's maybe 70 years of age, and if you have a person who's 20 years of age, and if you give them both 20 grams of, let's say, whey protein, a really high quality protein, you'll see that in this young person, their muscle protein synthesis will pretty much max out, okay, you
Mm-hmm.
at 20 grams. But if you've got that older person who's like 70 and you give them that same dose of protein, it'll rise, it'll definitely go up, but it won't go up as high as the younger person. So it might be half of the younger person. And that's anabolic resistance. Our body doesn't react as well to the protein. But we do know that to kind of counteract that effect of anabolic resistance, if you increase the amount of protein, and we actually think doubling the amount of protein in older people is a way to do it, you can get them to increase their muscle protein synthesis or the ability to build muscle over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we think older people should probably be eating more protein,
More protein.
and we should be eating more protein as we get older to help reduce the effect of or counteract the effect of anabolic resistance and to allow us to keep building and maintaining muscle as we get older. And
Mhm.
just kind of give a rule of thumb, 30 to 40 grams of protein as a bolus dose would be a good place to start for older people. And for a lot of older people, especially in countries where they might not be used to having a high protein intake in the first place, that is a lot of protein for people to try and be taking, and it's not easy. So again, you have to get this individualistic approach and say to these people, okay, how can we increase this protein in your diet? Do we need to
Mm-hmm.
maybe add supplements like protein powders or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, getting more protein is definitely one of them. But then from other aspects of cardiovascular health, there's a few kind of key things nutritionally that we need to be thinking of. And again, because my area is focusing on blood lipids, one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that somebody is not does not have very high levels of cholesterol, because excessively high levels of cholesterol in our body over time and over a very long amount of time, like we're talking a period of 40 or 50 years,
Mm-hmm.
can lead to atherosclerosis or the development of these plaques in
Got
our arteries that can eventually clog up. So keeping our cholesterol levels lower is a good idea. And one of the ways to do that is by making sure that we don't eat too much saturated fat. So like
okay.
I never say to somebody, you need to avoid saturated fat. So if we think saturated fat, that's the type of fat that we get in dairy products, that we get in meat, and then in a lot of processed foods, actually, because processed
Mm-hmm.
foods tend to have a lot of coconut oil or palm oil, and both of those are very highly saturated. So reducing those and then incorporating more unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats come from things like olive oil, they come from nuts, seeds, and basically plant sources. And that can actually help to reduce our cholesterol levels, and basically put us in a better position for long-term heart health. So that's one of the things. And then additionally, in addition to that, like I mentioned earlier, you want people to be very insulin sensitive. So that's where the exercise comes in. But on top of that, besides just focusing exclusively on the insulin sensitivity, like focusing on the insulin sensitivity, one thing that leads to poor insulin sensitivity and leads to higher levels of triglycerides is having a lot of excess body fat. So having excess body fat can make it more difficult to maintain healthy glucose levels. And that's something that for your heart health, you definitely want to do as well. So being more insulin sensitive by not carrying a lot of excess adiposity is a good idea. Interestingly, that amount of adiposity or that amount of fat differs between different ethnic groups. So for example, like in people from South Asian descent, so people from, for example, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, those areas, we know that at relatively low levels of body fat, they can actually develop this insulin resistance compared to people from Europe, for example. So that's why people from, let's say, from India or Pakistan, we see that they can develop type 2 diabetes at a very, very relatively low body weight. But that's because this excess body fat seems to have a more negative effect in this ethnic group. But then, like I said, losing that excess body fat, even if it's only a small amount, does seem to have a positive effect on improving insulin sensitivity as well. So yeah, not having too much excess body fat. So that's obviously maintaining a sufficient calorie intake that's not excessive is really, really important as well.
Absolutely, I can totally vouch for it, because what happens in India, probably I can talk about that majority of food that we intake, in fact, is focused on carbohydrates and fats. Protein is something which anybody will have to actually emphasize on. Totally, that they need to emphasize that you need to have protein, you need to have protein. Otherwise, if you see the staple food, the regular meal that anybody eats will be rich in carb sources and also fat. So a valid point, in fact. And also there are few supplements, if you see from the aspect of, say, coenzyme 10, there is a herb by name of, say, Arjuna. Then there are, in fact, there is arginine. So there are a few of the supplements that I have read about have good, say, impact on heart health.
Absolutely. There's also what, like, I think another one that I would say is, I think fish oils are a fantastic supplement for people as well. And if people are, if they're vegetarian, I think that there are some what we call algal DHA and EPA supplements, which are very, very beneficial as well. They're a bit expensive, but if somebody doesn't,
which one is that?
An alternative. So they're called algal oils, and they're basically oils that are extracted from algae, which are grown in tanks, and they're the only plant-based sources of EPA and DHA, which are normally found in fish oils. So they're very, very good, particularly for reducing inflammation and reducing triglycerides. And then just because you brought it up, and just because we're talking about Indian food, there's a herb called turmeric, and there's an extract of turmeric called curcumin. And curcumin, there's quite a bit of research that into curcumin around its effects on blood lipids, and it does seem to have beneficial effects on reducing our cholesterol, and particularly reducing something called LDL cholesterol, which is if you have too much in your body, it can lead to atherosclerosis. So that's some interesting area in that. It's actually something that we're hoping to maybe look into at my institution here. So stay tuned.
I'm sure. So so would you also be comfortable talking about the mechanism of cardio? Would you be comfortable
about how it affects?
Yeah. So I'll tell you why I'm asking this, because cardio is one term which is actually beaten so much, that what kind of cardio, for how much, for how long duration, when it should be done, like before the workout, outside the workout, any different point in time, any different day from resistance training, at what intensity, what is the mode of cardio. So there is so much of, bro science around it, that, and actually, if in case you see, there is no, say, evidence-based approach that anybody would want to follow for cardio. They would just want to like hop onto a treadmill and do for hours and hours of cardio. So I'll tell you, in fact, why people majorly focus on doing cardio is just, in fact, losing body fat, losing that extra calories, and also few of the people who are educated enough would just in fact also want to do cardio for their cardiovascular health, but without understanding its benefit. So
Mhm.
what is the reality behind it?
So there's a few different ways that cardio affects our health. One of them is in cardiac physiology, okay, which cardiac physiology is not particularly my area, but basically when we do cardio, our heart has to work harder. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this comes back to this adaptive effect of exercise. If our heart needs to work harder, it needs to get stronger and it needs to improve its ability to pump. And that is one of the effects that cardiovascular exercise has. This tends to happen better with higher intensities of activity. And this is why the current guidelines from, I think, the World Health Organization around exercise are saying that every week everyone should do 150 minutes. So basically, let's say 30 minutes a day of moderate to high intensity activity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is to improve that cardiac function, improve our VO2 max, because it's such a good indicator of long-term health. Okay.
Mm.
So basically what you're doing is you're making the heart better at pumping blood around the body. But another interesting aspect that doesn't get a huge amount of attention is the effect that exercise has on what's called the endothelia of our blood vessels. So if you imagine our blood vessels, they consist of an outer layer, they've got a muscular layer, and then just inside that muscular layer, you've got a single layer of cells called the endothelia that's around it.
Mm-hmm.
And the endothelia is very, very important for our vascular health.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons for this is because when we exercise, we obviously you're exercising, you're pumping more blood
Mm-hmm.
through the blood, and the blood is flowing it's not just more blood, it's more blood at a higher intensity. There's a higher force going behind it. And what this does is it increases something called shear stress. And
Okay.
that shear stress is the physical force that our cells, our endothelial cells, can feel pushing against them or rubbing against them. And that shear force, it stimulates our cells to give us a number of benefits. But one of the primary benefits is the synthesis of a compound called nitric oxide. Okay, and
Okay.
nitric oxide is actually a gas that gets produced in our blood vessels. And what nitric oxide does is it causes our blood vessels to relax
To
and to dilate and
dilate.
to get bigger. And that allows more blood flow to get through it. And in the long term, so obviously that allows you to pump more blood, you become more effective and more efficient when you're running. But in the long-term endurance exercise, it helps to reduce blood pressure. And one of the reasons you want to reduce blood pressure is because obviously blood pressure is a major risk for cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know that reducing blood pressure also helps to reduce the risk of pushing those blood lipids that we spoke about earlier, the cholesterol.
Yeah.
Higher levels of blood pressure can actually cause higher levels of infiltration of those cholesterols into the inside of our blood vessels where they start to form those plaques. So
Mm-hmm.
reducing our overall blood pressure is one really, really good way of reducing the risk of that happening and kind of reducing the development of plaques in our arteries over time.
Okay. So just one very important and keeping your time and watch. So one very important and very basic question. So what happens with today's youth is that everybody is so focused on quick results, on the muscle size, muscle shape, muscle definition, that I hardly find anybody focusing on importance of training hard, training hard for performance, and why it is important. So would you want to talk about why it is important to train hard for your health?
Yeah, so that's a very good point, and I understand it because a lot of young people they go into the gym and they just want to look good, and
Yeah,
like everybody
absolutely.
wants to get a big pair of muscles. So and this kind of touches on something you mentioned earlier about people asking when should I do my cardio? Should I do it on the same day or after training? Because a lot of people are concerned that doing cardio is going to interfere with the effects of their muscle building, and it shouldn't. So like they can both be incorporated together, and in fact, we know that doing cardio also one effect that it has is it increases microvascularization. And what that means is basically vascularization means the number of very, very small capillaries and veins that we have going through our different tissues and within our muscles as well. So doing more cardio actually increases our what we call capillary density, so the amount
Mm-hmm.
of those little blood vessels flowing through our muscles. Because if we're doing more cardio, our muscles need to get oxygen faster when we're training.
Mm-hmm.
But that has the knock-on benefit of also potentially improving hypertrophy effects, because a muscle that is well supplied with blood vessels is well supplied with oxygen, is well supplied with glucose and amino acids and all of the things that it needs for growth as well. And on top of that, being more cardiovascular fit can also allow you to train just that little bit harder. That will allow you to get, maybe a couple of extra reps in the gym, which will help over time. And this is very, very a long-term conversation over time to help somebody hopefully build more muscle as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just an instant, and thanks for this context. That's a very relevant and very important point from a longevity perspective. So anybody, in fact, I see a lot of people nowadays. What happens that they are big, in fact, having good bulk in their muscle size, and just after performing one set, they are like huffing and puffing like anything. They are not able to breathe appropriately. In fact, they are actually breathing from their mouth. Actually, they're gasping so heavily just after, say, even a one set of bench press. In fact, just doing maybe a deadlift. They are not training for hard. They are not training for endurance, and even then, that happens. Why does that happen?
So if somebody is not very, very cardiovascularly fit, that's a pretty normal response. And like I've been through it as well. I've had times in my life where I have not focused on cardio at all, and I used to think that like doing more than 5 reps was considered cardio in the gym of whatever exercise you're doing. Um, but it's a normal physiological response, because our body is struggling to pump blood. Because if you're the extent of your exercise is going into the gym and you're doing 6 exercises, 4 sets, 5 to 10 reps or something like that, that is not a lot of movement. Your
Mm-hmm.
body and your heart are not getting all of the training stimulus that they need to improve your VO2 max. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why having that little bit of cardio incorporated into your routine can improve that VO2 max, which improves your health and longevity, but it can also improve your performance in the gym as well and help
Absolutely.
recovery between sets, for example.
Absolutely. Any sort of say any regime that anybody can. This is the last question to you, and any sort of regime that anybody can follow to improve heart health, like doing cardio on a separate day, or say a 20-minute cardio before exercise or after exercise. Any sort of say a rough management regarding how can anybody plan a cardio in their workouts?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm like, again, this is just one way of doing it. I think like many people in the world today, I'm time poor. So I just don't have enough hours in the day. So it's always trying to find the quickest way of doing it. I will say to people, if they don't want cardio to affect their gym training,
Mm-hmm.
do your gym training first and do your cardio after, or do your cardio on a separate day where you're not in the gym, and that's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely fine as well. And then if you want to kind of keep things very, very simple, I really like high intensity interval training. And one of the protocols you can use for that, for example, is one thing that I like is a minute and a half, sorry, 30 seconds on and then 90 seconds off of active recovery. And that can be, for example, if you do that on an assault bike, like you mentioned, that would be a 30-second all-out sprint. And then you've got a 90-second recovery period where you're just going slowly, and then you do that for 5, 6, 7 rounds or something like that, and that will it'll destroy you at the end. But it's a
Actually,
really, really good way. Yeah, it's a great way of getting your heart rate up. It's a great way of getting a lot of that cardiovascular benefit in a
mm-hmm.
short amount of time, and it's also not going to tax your recovery too much, because they're only a few short bouts of high intensity work. But it's like getting the most bang for your buck. That's one way of doing it. There are other ways, but that's
Yep.
one way of doing it.
Okay. And I'm sure that I recommend all my clients and all my audience to get regular blood work done. In fact, every 3 months or every 6 months. Any specific, say, blood markers you would want to mention just to assess the cardiovascular health?
Yeah, I say it's always good to know what your cholesterol levels are and get a good breakdown. Ideally, if you can get a look at your total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL, and then one thing that most people will not see is something called ApoB, and ApoB is just it's a marker of the amount of particles that lipid particles somebody has in their body, and it tends to be probably one of the best measures of cardiovascular health.
Oh,
Getting
that's
a good look
interesting.
at triglycerides and knowing what your HbA1c. So HbA1c is an indicator of your blood glucose over the past 3 months.
Yeah.
And if, as long as they are within healthy ranges, that's what you want. If HbA1c is a bit excessive, then you might think there's a problem with glucose control. If triglycerides are very high, there's also an indicator of potentially insulin resistance as well, something people need to be cautious of too.
So I also would recommend measurement of CRP and also
Mm-hmm.
the blood calcium levels, the calcification. In fact, by they can say assess the deposition of calcium into the arteries, because that's majorly for people, in fact, who are enhanced, because for them this is the major thing that happens. And what did you mention? ApoB. What's that?
ApoB, so it's apolipoprotein B. So I mentioned
ApoB.
earlier LDL cholesterol, and there's
Yes, you did.
also VLDL cholesterol. So the cholesterol is what's carried, but what's carrying it is a carrier protein, and that carrier protein is called apolipoprotein B, and that's actually attached to LDL cholesterol, it's attached to VLDL cholesterol, it's
Mhm.
attached to IDL cholesterol. So it's a measure of how many particles of this you have floating around in your body. It's not the most common of tests, but it's something that we're using in our research because we think it gives a really, really good indicator of cardiovascular health.
Yeah, to be very frank, I have heard it for the very first time. That's so interesting.
Okay,
Yeah, that's so
cool.
interesting. Yeah. Well, Richard, in fact, it was such an amazing interaction with you, and I'm sure that we'll keep in touch and also interact on many more sessions. I wish you the best, in fact, in your new opportunity that you have taken as a professor in the university, and stay tuned for more, in fact, information, guys, coming from us. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day ahead, Richard. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much, Abby. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.